Day of the Dead Moon, Part 2.
Lord Chelmsford's tactic was that he intended to invade Zululand with 3 huge columns and 2 small columns. One of the major columns, under the command of Colonel Pearson, was to travel up the coast. Colonel Evelyn Wood's column was to come into Cetshwayo's territory from the northwest. And the largest of the 3, the big central column, was to move from Pietermaritzburg to Greytown, across the Tugela River at the Tugela Ferry, to help Makaar, and from there descend and ford the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift, and take the central route to Ulundi. Rorke's Drift was a good place to ford. The drift there consisted of a series of natural sandstone causeways, where wagon wheels could get purchase, even when the river was running strongly in the wet season, and that season was particularly wet. Rorke's Drift was also the gateway to a huge expanse of open rolling country, which led off to the east, eventually dropping off into the Valley of the Kings, in which lay Ulundi, 65 miles away. Chelmsford and his staff accompanied this column, and he therefore superseded the column commander, Colonel Richard Thomas Glynn. Chelmsford was not only the commander-in-chief, he was de facto column commander as well. The central column was made up of 4,800 men, over 200 wagons and thousands of oxen. Over half the men of Chelmsford's force that invaded Zululand were black, most of them Zulu-speaking blacks, living in Natal, who'd had an axe to grind against their North Tugela neighbours. They were grouped into a corps, the Natal native contingent. They were poorly trained. In some instances they were not trained at all, and very poorly equipped, with only 1 rifle for every 10 men and only 5 cartridges per rifle. Many British officers considered them to be more of a liability than an asset, and they were rather disparagingly referred to as being the untrained untrainables. The backbone of the central column was made up of 2 battalions of the 20th from Brecon in Wales. The column waited on the Natal bank for the ultimatum to expire. The ultimatum duly expired at midnight on the 10th of January 1879, and the next day, the 11th, with the band of the 24th Regiment of Foot probably playing men of Harlech, the invasion of Zululand begins. On crossing the Buffalo, Chelmsford decided to punish Schayo, the man who'd given Freer the pretext for the issuing of the ultimatum. Schayo lived in a beautiful valley, the Bache, east of Rorke's Drift. As it happens, Schayo was not at home. He was with his friend, the king, at Ulundi, way off to the east. His warriors were ensconced in a huge horseshoe-shaped gorge of sandstone flanking the Bache River. The gorge is bordered by a lofty set of blood-red cliffs puckered with caves, beneath which lies a jumble of house-sized boulders. The British intention was to flush Schayo's men from the caves, and then move up the Bache Valley and destroy Schayo's homestead, Sokehle, by fire. The force selected to perform this task was the NNC, the so-called untrained untrainables, and one does get the impression that this was to test the NNC in battle, as well as to provide the British with some entertainment. British officers were selected to lead the NNC into this gorge, one of whom was a delightful youngster who'd endeared himself to the British High Command in the preceding days. His name was Henry Charles Harford. He was a naturalist, and he kept a lively journal which is very useful to me in re-establishing our little game reserve. A couple of nights before the invasion, Harford had leant across the mess table and helped himself to Major Cleary's gin, which he decanted off into a little jar in which he was attempting to preserve his scorpions. Harford voiced his disgust at having to lead the untrained NNC force into battle. He had never been in battle before himself, and he complained to his superior, a rough diamond of a New Zealander by the name of Commandant George Maury Hamilton Brown. Maury Brown patted him on the head and said, "Don't worry, Charlie, you'll be fine." One must now imagine the scene. An extremely jittery Charlie Harford leading a possibly more jittery NNC. It reads like a Rider Haggard story. As they moved into the gorge, a Zulu shouted at them in English from a cave, "By whose orders do you come?" And an officer called Duncombe stood forth and shouted back a patent untruth. By the orders of the Great White Queen, he shouted. The attack commenced, and it became quite a heated skirmish when the British forces got into the boulders beneath the cliffs, and it was at this moment that Harford collapsed, and a cry went up in the gorge, "Harford is killed! Harford is killed!" Hamilton Brown heard the shout, and raced up into the gorge, expecting to find Harford dead. He found this lunatic natural historian on his hands and knees in the midst of battle. This kid who'd expressed his fears about going into battle for the first time was intent on transferring a rare beetle that he'd spotted into a matchbox. Such was the stuff of which this empire was made. Harford put the microbe into the box. Schaya's warriors were flushed out of the caves. The British force moved up the Bache Valley and destroyed Schaya's homestead. They opened and destroyed his grain pits. They captured his livestock. They killed his son. Umkumbika Zulu was dead. And Lord Chelmsford turned to his staff officers and said, "You see, it's going to be easy. All we have to do is get them to fight." Chelmsford was making a deadly comparison. He deduced that fighting AmaZulu and fighting AmaXhosa would constitute the same problem. I believe that the incident at Schayos was critical in formulating a complacent attitude that was to surface in a few days' time, and that it was with this complacency in his breast that Chelmsford arrived on the saddle of a strange sphinx-like mountain that the Zulus call Isandlwana. Isandlwana. Intabale Isandlwana. That mountain looks like a little house. He arrived there with a sergeant on the 17th of January 1879. They knee-halted their horses and climbed up onto the shoulder of the hill, and they looked out at the awesome view eastward. They gazed at the huge expanse of territory of the Ngutu district. Anyone climbing onto the shoulder of Isandlwana cannot but be impressed by the scene which impressed Chelmsford that day. That immense view, off to the east, 70 square miles of unimpeded view in the direction of Ulundi, the direction from which a Zulu attack would come in that unlikely event, so they thought. He also knew that from the ridge of the Ngutu Plateau north of Isandlwana there was a view of 35 square miles to the north, and that from the top of the stony hill south of the track there was a view 35 square miles to the south. And he knew that if he put a lookout on the western slope of Isandlwana, the man would be able to scrutinize 45 square miles of territory looking back towards Rorke's Drift. What a superb spot this was, from a military point of view. It was right on the old wagon track. It had plenty of commanding high ground. There was an abundance of water and a plethora of firewood behind the hill, which was a huge boon in an environment which is naturally free of trees. Little has changed there to this day. Chelmsford decided that this would be a suitable spot for a temporary bivouac for the central column on its way into Zululand. One must bear in mind Chelmsford's tactic. He was going to invade with these 3 huge columns, which, because of the huge wagon trains of impedimenta, would have to move slowly, and the wetness of the season would not help them. They would crawl towards Ulundi, consolidating their military position as they advanced, driving the Zulus before them until they had converged on Ulundi. Chelmsford hoped that the Zulus would eventually oppose him, maybe even on the great Mahlabatini plain in front of the Zulu capital, and there he would smash them, preferably in the open. Oh dear God, I pray that we get a chance to fight them in the open. Orders were sent back to his staff that they were to move the column and camp at this spot. By January the 20th, the whole force had arrived at Isandlwana. Camp was set up on the gentle slopes on the eastern side of the hill. If you could imagine a huge white splash of army canvas 3/4 of a square mile in extent on that gentle slope, beneath the lion-like crag of the mountain, neat rows of white tents. From the foot of the Isandlwana hill right across the saddle to the stony kopje was designated as the wagon park. And if you could imagine that in this area are crammed hundreds of wagons and carts and thousands of livestock. These are not the little fighting wagons of the Boers, but long wheel-based transport wagons that could carry tons of commissariat. The heavy ones were dragged along by double spans of oxen, and together with their trek-tower, voorlopers and achterrijers, you could only fit 20 of these wagons nose to tail into a mile. They were difficult to maneuver, with larger turning circles, and very difficult to lager. Lagering by definition meant that one had to outspan all the oxen, and then manually push the wagons against each other, with the disselboom of the rear wagon being pushed under the front one, and then locking the wheels together. 50 men were needed to push an unladen wagon, and much more for a full one. 50 of those wagons were always on the way back to Rorke's Drift for more supplies. Lagering at Isandlwana was never even attempted. Chelmsford decided, for the reasons already mentioned, that he could not implement the advice given him by Paul Kruger himself. The area subtended by such a lager would in any event have been unmanageably large. For good logical reasons, lagering was not done. Chelmsford also failed to order the entrenching of the camp, and by not doing so, he in fact disobeyed one of his own standing instructions. When this was pointed out to him by one of his staff officers, his reply was that it would take at least a week to entrench, that is, to dig in this hard, shaly earth, and that he only intended being at Isandlwana for 2 days. Even if they had started to dig in, I don't believe it would have made any difference at all. Chelmsford now gets news from his various black spies that the Zulu army had been summoned by the king and addressed by him at the great military kraal of Nodwengu in the Valley of the Kings on the 17th of January. They had been sent out, and they could be expected to appear any day now in those hills 12 miles off to the southeast of Isandlwana. What Chelmsford did not know was what the actual brief of the Zulu army was. The Zulu army was briefed, as we now know, as follows. The king told his warriors that they were to march slowly. Those coming from the far-flung outer areas were to conserve their energy by marching only 40 miles a day instead of the normal 60. They were told to conserve carefully their food, a dried maize biscuit ration that they kept in sporran-like pouches on their kilts. It was the biscuit that formed on the inside of the cast-iron pot, or the clay pot, when maize porridge was cooked. We used to fight over it as kids. The Zulus call it isikako. The warriors were told to nibble on it conservatively. The warriors were told to repulse this invasion. But they were instructed not to cross into Natal. Cetshwayo was adamant that he would maintain his ethics. He was being invaded, and it was his intention to repulse this invasion. But he would not let his impis go into Natal. Some were to disobey him, as you will see indeed at Rorke's Drift. The Zulus were told that they were not to fight the British if the British were fighting from prepared positions. They had learned the lesson of Blood River, but rather that they were to take the British force on in the open. They were going to give Lord Chelmsford the battle that he dreamed about. The Zulus were also told, and there's some of the magic of Isandlwana in this one, that they were not to fight if they could help it on the day of the dead moon, which was approaching. The whole concept of the day of the dead moon is an interesting one, which has perplexed many people writing about this battle. It is simply the day when the sun and the moon are together, and the moon is therefore invisible. It's like a Sabbath for the Zulus. They do not marry on the day of the dead moon. Neither will they bury their dead on that day, and they won't fight a pitched battle if they can help it on such an inauspicious day. Isn't it interesting that this battle, Isandlwana, was fought on Wednesday the 22nd of January 1879, which as it happened was the day of the dead moon. We know that it was the day of the dead moon because when Captain Reginald Younghusband was standing on that large rock on the shoulder of the hill with his men of C Company, 1st Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, with their bayonets fixed and their backs against that very rock, there was an eclipse of the sun. And you only get eclipses of the sun when the sun and the moon are together. Isn't it interesting to contemplate that in the zenith of this terrible battle, this, the greatest defeat that Britain was ever to suffer in the colonies, the sun should go dark like night in the moment of the last stand. And the soldiers of the 24th, many of them superstitious Welshmen, didn't like this place. There was a sinister feeling in the air. They didn't like the uncanny resemblance the mountain had to the Sphinx, which was featured on their regimental badge. The Sphinx was incorporated into the badge of the 24th after this regiment had helped to defeat Napoleon in Egypt in 1801. One man who was to get out of this mess was to recall that in all his life he'd never felt such a strong presentiment of coming evil as on that day. One gets a marvelous feel for the atmosphere in that camp if one reads those letters that were written by soldiers in the ranks, soldiers who were to die on that fatal field. These letters arrived back in their beloved Wales long after their disemboweled bodies had dried out at Isandlwana. Go and read the letters that were written by Owen Ellis from Carnarvon in North Wales and George Morris from Pontypool in South Wales. Chelmsford sent out scouts into the east and southeast. They went as far as that Isipezi mountain 15 miles away, and yes indeed they came upon Zulus. As Chelmsford suspected, there was a movement of Zulus into those hills, and this information confirmed the presupposition that Chelmsford harboured, that the Zulus would use that broken ground to the southeast to harry his invasion into Zululand from a flank. His great fear was that the Zulus en masse would move through all that broken country, cross the Buffalo in some remote gorge, and wreak havoc in Natal while he was stuck up in Zululand with these 3 cumbersome columns. He was therefore resolved the next day, Tuesday, the 21st of January, that he was going to send a reconnaissance in strength into those hills, and accordingly he sent 70 white mounted men and 1,600 men of the NNC under the command of an experienced colonial officer, Major John Dartnell, officer commanding the Natal Mounted Police, to investigate. Dartnell duly went off to the southeast and found very few Zulus, and those that he did find ran away. Dartnell split his force to look for the elusive Zulu, dangerous thing to do, and Dartnell was pounced upon by a large force of Zulus which attempted to surround him, using their famous tactic of the horns of the buffalo. Dartnell escaped by the skin of his teeth, and that night he sent a message to Chelmsford. Lieutenant Walsh brought the message in, and it was handed to the general just after midnight on that fateful Wednesday. The message excited Chelmsford. It told him that these people wanted to fight, which was indeed good news. Dartnell also told him that from his position on the top of the mountain of Hlazagaz, the mountain of blue blood, what a lovely name, what a lovely mountain, he could see that the mountains of Magogo way off to his southeast were becoming peppered with the bivouac fires of thousands of Zulus, and the inference was that he was up against the main Zulu army. One cannot blame Chelmsford for believing him. He was reacting logically to information which became available. Chelmsford has been vilified in history for not lagering and not entrenching that camp. He now sends his orderly to summon his staff officers to his tent, and they huddled over one of the inefficient maps of the area under the inefficient light of an old oil lamp, and they made a decision in that tent, and there was a curse on this decision, and the decision was to split Chelmsford's column, to go and reinforce Dartnell, and to tackle the Zulus way off there to the southeast. The book says that one must never divide one's forces in the enemy's territory until one has ascertained the precise disposition of the enemy's troops. Well, Chelmsford believed that he did know what the enemy's dispositions were. Dartnell was telling him, but Dartnell was wrong. Therefore Chelmsford was wrong. Therefore, indeed, they were all wrong. His commanders were told to prepare to move out with an expeditionary force, while leaving a strong garrison to guard the camp. Chelmsford makes some amends for splitting his force. He summoned to his tent a young officer who was attached to his staff for transport duties. His name was Horace Lockwood Smith Dorrien. What a famous figure he was to become in British military history. Smith Dorrien was told to ride back along the track to Rorke's Drift, 11 miles away, across enemy territory on a night so black he later remembered that he couldn't see his hand in front of his face. The 20-year-old lieutenant was told to summon Lieutenant Colonel Anthony William Durnford, Royal Engineer, and his force of 450 highly trained, mostly mounted black soldiers, and enter Colonel Durnford into our story. We know very little about Isandlwana. This saga must be one of the great enigmas of military history, and people will argue and debate over what happened here for the rest of time. But we do have some very useful information on some of the characters involved, and we would do well for a minute or two to investigate this man, Anthony Durnford, who was to play such a remarkable role in this battle. Durnford had been in Natal since 1872. He was colonial engineer, attached to the Natal colonial government. In 1873, Durnford was instructed to lead a force of the Natal Carbineers into the Bushman's River Pass in the Natal Drakensberg to bring to heel a recalcitrant Hlubi chieftain called Langa Libalele. Lovely name, Langa Libalele. Ilanga, the sun. Alibalele never stopped shining. Langa Libalele had been running guns from the diamond fields of Kimberley into Natal. He'd been told to report to the magistrate at Escort in the Natal Midlands to explain his position, and he'd failed to do so, and this force was going to go and bring him in. The plan was that the force was to split. Durnford was to lead half the force up the Giant's Castle Pass, which lies to the south and flanks the Bushman's River Pass, up which Langa Libalele was suspected to be making his way to the safety of Basutoland. Simultaneously, another officer, Allison, was to ascend a pass to the north, and having attained the plateau at the top, the two forces were to move towards each other, meet at the top of the Bushman's River Pass, and trap old Longbelly, as they called him, in the pass. It was a bitterly cold November night. Durnford's guide got confused, and instead of leading Durnford up the Giant's Castle Pass, he led the men up a dangerous, precipitous pass, the Hlathemba, further to the south. Durnford was in terrible shape. Earlier that day, whilst riding his beloved horse Chieftain that Durnford had broken in, and he alone rode this animal, Chieftain lost his footing, and horse and rider rolled down a steep slope for 50 yards. Miraculously, the horse had escaped injury, but Durnford was badly injured. He had a great gash in his head, had bruised 2 ribs, and had dislocated his left shoulder. Despite these injuries, Durnford, lapsing in and out of consciousness, led the men up the almost impossible track of the Hlathemba Pass. Having got to the top, they moved to the head of the Bushman's River Pass, and found that for other reasons Allison was not there. Durnford and his men peered over the escarpment and were mortified to see that the pass was literally choked with hundreds of heavily armed Hlubi tribesmen making their way up towards them. Durnford was hampered by a ridiculous instruction that under no circumstances was he to fire the first shot. Somehow the Hlubis knew of this instruction, and they advanced boldly, taking up positions in the high ground around his position. Durnford's force of Natal Carbineers became jittery, and many men deserted, leaving Durnford in the lurch with only half a force. A rout developed as the Hlubis attacked. 3 Carbineers were killed, as well as a number of native levies, as they called them. Durnford's beloved interpreter, Sergeant Major Elijah Kambula, shot dead at his side, shook Durnford badly, and Durnford himself took a terrible assegai thrust through the elbow of his already dislocated arm, a wound which severed the nerve and the blood vessels, leaving the arm forever useless. But despite these additional injuries, Durnford very skillfully managed to extract his men from the Bushman's River Pass. Durnford was blamed for this disaster. It was later dubbed Durnford's first disaster. He tried to defend himself by explaining that if he had been given reasonable instructions, and if the Carbineers had not deserted, things might have been different. But the Natal Carbineers were the creme de la creme of the Natal colonial militia, and they did not brook this sort of criticism too lightly. Durnford becomes unpopular in Pietermaritzburg. Durnford was a great champion of the rights of downtrodden black people in this country. He had stood up for the rights of the displaced Amangwane people who were being shunted around by Shepston's native policy, which was, as it happened, one of the origins of legislated apartheid, to the point where Durnford was becoming something of an embarrassment to the Natal colonial government. Eventually he was brought before the acting Lieutenant Governor, Sir Garnet Wolseley, who informed Durnford that he was busy jeopardizing his chances for promotion in Natal. Durnford replied politely that the rights of the Amangwane people were much more important than his promotion, an indication of the character of this man. Durnford was a maverick. He was a compulsive gambler. He was an impetuous man. He was separated from his wife, though not divorced. He defended their separation by saying that they had parted over the fact that Mrs. Durnford used to spend his measly military stipend too freely. The gossip of the period tells us, however, that Mrs. Durnford had started taking lovers, and it's a further mark of Durnford's character that he should stand up for her under these circumstances. Durnford was a champion of the Zulus. He was anti any conflict with the Zulus. He had sat on that boundary commission in 1878 and helped find in favor of the Zulus. The fact that he was probably vociferously anti all that imperial activity that led to the outbreak of war contributed to his unpopularity in Pietermaritzburg, where the colonials eventually poisoned his beloved dog Prince. Tortured soul, this Durnford. He was flung by the forces of fate into the arms of the bishop, Bishop John William Colenso, Bishop of Natal, that great champion of the Zulus. And Durnford and Colenso become great friends, and he spent much of his free time at Bishopstow, the bishop's residence outside Pietermaritzburg. Durnford apparently cut quite a dashing figure. He was a tall, good-looking man, with a wide brow, and his long moustaches, and his withered arm. And bless him, hot-blooded Irishman that he was, he fell in love with the bishop's daughter Frances. This really put the pious Calvinistic colonials in Pietermaritzburg into a froth. That the senior military man was having a fling with the bishop's daughter was too much for them to bear, and Durnford's unpopularity increased. But Durnford was an excellent soldier, and Lord Chelmsford knew this. Durnford had therefore been placed in command of No. 2 column, a mini-column between the coastal column and the one at Rorke's Drift. He was told to hold the middle drift on the Tugela, 70 miles from Rorke's Drift. His force was to consist largely of his own hand-picked, highly trained men, Durnford's Basutos they were called, comfortably the finest black mounted infantry that this country was ever to see. He had drawn them from the Amangwane, Amangwe, Tlokwe and Hlubi tribes, and they loved him to distraction, as you will see. When the ultimatum expired, Durnford received some incorrect information from a missionary called Schroeder that the Zulus were massing opposite his position, and he took it upon himself to go off on his own little mini-invasion of Zululand. And when Chelmsford heard of this, he was enraged, and he sent a message to Durnford filled with good British innuendo. The gist of it was, "Dear Durnford, get out of Zululand, and you will move from the middle drift on the Tugela up to Rorke's Drift on the Buffalo, and there you will await further instructions from me. And if you give me further reason to communicate with you in a manner which is distasteful to me, it will be my unpleasant duty to remove you from your command." Durnford, loving, lovable Durnford, hypersensitive Durnford, had now arrived at Rorke's Drift. He wrote a letter to his mother, which survives, which illustrates how hurt he felt at having received such short shrift from Chelmsford. And it was this depressed Durnford that Smith Dorrien was now sent to fetch on the pre-dawn of that fateful day. At 3:30 a.m. on that Wednesday, the camp at Isandlwana would have looked like a dull white blob on that pitch-black landscape on that moonless night. The scene would have been accompanied by the soft clink of saddlery and the crunch of thousands of steel-shod boots as Lord Chelmsford moved out with over half the force. They were going off to the southeast to reinforce Dartnell, and Chelmsford was destined to spend the most unsatisfactory day of his life out there skirmishing with small parties of Zulus. Chelmsford had left in command at Isandlwana a brevet lieutenant colonel by the name of Henry Burmeister Pullain. An interesting character, Pullain, a thoroughly good and reliable officer who'd been in this famous line regiment for 24 years, but he'd never seen a shot fired in action. This is not a criticism of Pullain at all. It's just an interesting point. But it may be telling us that Lord Chelmsford was taking his fighting officers out with him while leaving his good administrator behind. In rather vague orders, Pullain was told to look after the camp. He was also told that during the day Lord Chelmsford would identify the new campsite, and a dispatch would then be sent back to Pullain to advise him to strike the camp, to pack all the impedimenta onto the wagons, and bring it out to the new site. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. It was going to be a very hot day. Pullain was in his tent, near Chelmsford's tent. The men were having their breakfast. The picket or lookout on the top of that Ngutu plateau to the north at this time came in with a rather alarming message. There were apparently thousands of Zulus on the top of that plateau, and they were advancing towards the left front of the camp. Pullain sat down at his portmanteau and penciled a note. The note survives. Today it's in the Barracks Museum of the 24th Regiment in Brecon in Wales. And the note read, 8:05 a.m. Staff Officer, sir, a report has just come in that the Zulus are advancing in force towards the left front of the camp. He tore it off the writing block and gave it to a dispatch rider, lucky boy, and told him to take it to the general. He then walked across to where the men were having breakfast, and he prevailed upon his staff officers to get the men to leave their breakfasts unfinished. They were told to don their webbing, which contained ammunition pouches, which contained between 50 and 70 rounds of ammunition per man. And they were told to take their modern, lever-action, breech-loading Martini Henry rifles and to form up in a line, a firing line, 1,000 yards from the camp across the northeast quarter, facing the plateau. There were 1,000 men in that line, and the men stood between 3 and 5 yards apart. 600 of those soldiers were Imperial soldiers, and they stood there in their hot serge uniforms and their steel-shod boots, and they faced that plateau. 2 7-pounder guns of the Royal Artillery were placed on the top of a low ridge on the knuckle of that line. The men stood there, and nothing happened. The lookout returned to his position and looked out. There were no Zulus. The Zulus had gone. He must have wiped his eyes and looked again. He remounted his horse and returned to camp and reported this to Pullain. Pulain was then prevailed upon by his staff officers to allow the men to fall out and return to the camp to finish their breakfasts, which in the interim had grown cold. This happened. The men were told to keep their webbing on and their rifles at the ready. There was much unhappiness about the breakfast. The few men who got out tell us that it was cold and inedible, though they hastened to mention that even when it was hot, they said it was also inedible. In any event, the men ate their breakfast with long teeth, and they were then told to return to their positions. Pulain now decided to send 2 companies up onto a low ridge to the north of the camp, from which they would have a view down a valley which extends off to the northwest, away from Isandlwana. I believe that this was an intelligent move to cover that broken area to the northwest. These soldiers had just got onto their positions when there was a commotion on the saddle. The commotion was caused by the arrival of our friend with the long moustaches and the withered arm. Durnford had arrived at the head of his 450 mostly mounted, highly trained, hand-picked Basutos. Immediately the command structure of the camp at Isandlwana was in confusion. By rights, Lieutenant Colonel Durnford should have acceded to command of the camp. He was now the senior officer. He was a lieutenant colonel with the brevet of full colonel, and was therefore a full-rank senior to Pulain. I believe that because of his wounded psychological state he was not going to insist on being handed the camp, and his instructions from Chelmsford were vague enough, and Pulain, for all we know, may have chuckled in the mess tent the previous evening over this maverick Durnford, and he might have been waiting for Durnford to insist on being given command. In any event, there was something of an impasse between these 2 officers, about which we know a little, thanks to the testimonies of the few men who survived. One of these was an officer called Cochrane. Cochrane, an officer of the 32nd Regiment attached to Durnford's staff, indicates that he and Durnford dismounted on the saddle and knee-halted their horses. Durnford was riding his beloved chieftain, and the men walked across the area of coal-bearing shale to Pulain's tent, where they had a late breakfast in the tent, and the conversation went something like this. "Morning, Pulain." "Morning, Colonel Durnford." "What's happening, Pulain?" "Well, sir, we had a report of a Zulu advance from the northeast, and I've strung out that firing line to face that threat. I've sent 2 companies to the top of the ridge to the northwest, and I've sent a message to the general. That's what's happening, sir." One can forget about Durnford's politics, that he was pro-Zulu and anti any conflict with the Zulu. He was a soldier, and he would behave like a soldier, and indeed provide British military history with one of their greatest legends of all time. Because Durnford thereupon asked Pulain for 2 companies of his infantry soldiers. Then he said, together with his mounted men, he would ascend the Ngutu heights, find the Zulus and fight them. Pulain demurred. He said no. He had been told to stay in the camp, and that is what he intended to do. He was also awaiting Chelmsford's instructions to strike the camp, and he would need men to do that, but replied, "But you, sir, are senior to me. Why don't you assume command officially and tell me what to do, and I will do it with pleasure." The ball was back in Durnford's court, and Durnford typically backed down. "You stay in the camp," he said, "and I'm going to move out in that easterly direction with all my men, and I'm going to drive a wedge between the Zulus to the north of the camp, and Lord Chelmsford and his men to the southeast, thereby protecting Lord Chelmsford's flank from attack by those Zulus." As Durnford left, he turned in the saddle, and he shouted back at Pulain a shout which may well have been the death knell of so many of these men. "If I get into trouble out there, Pulain, I'm going to expect you to keep your line extended and support me." Off Durnford went, on horseback. Soon they passed that conical kopje 2 miles east of Isandlwana, keeping it to their left. Durnford had with him a rocket battery. This rocket consisted of a simple metal trough, about 4 feet long, with a bipod that one erected against it. It was a primitive precursor of the mortar, and it fired a 9-pounder rocket. The tail of this rocket had a stabilizing flue, which caused it to scream, and it was designed to explode case-shot all over the primitive enemy, striking terror into the hearts of one's opponents, who would then be expected to down their primitive weapons and flee. The instructions on the rocket literally read almost as follows. When confronted by large numbers of advancing savages, you are to erect the bipod against the trough and aim the apparatus at the savages. Take 1 9-pound Hale Congreve rocket out of the box, arm it, and place it in the base of the trough. Pull the lanyard, which was a little piece of string which would activate the friction tube, and set it off. Stand back then, for God's sake. This was a wildly inaccurate device, and apparently there was a pretty good chance that it would shoot off only to return and land on your own head. Well, Durnford had one of these. The rocket battery was under the immediate command of Major Francis Broadfoot Russell, and consisted of one bombardier and a small escort of men seconded from the 24th Regiment. They were told off to drag the rocket from the conical hill through all the eroded country that extends up to the plateau, to ascend the plateau at the notch, and to take up a position on the top of the Tusi, the highest point of that escarpment. Durnford proceeded eastward. Durnford had decided, and it has long perplexed students of this battle why between Pulain and Durnford they had taken so long to come to this decision, to send a patrol up onto that plateau to see what was happening. Accompanying this patrol was a man who was to survive. His name was Raw, Charlie Raw, a man who'd been with Durnford in the Bushman's River Pass. Raw was to have a chilling experience. They trotted up to the lip of the Ngutu plateau and peered over it. There were no Zulus to be seen, and they scrutinized this area for some time. They then noticed that way off to the northeast there was a large herd of cattle being shepherded along by little Zulu herd boys. They thought that they should give chase. They might as well loot the cattle. So they put spurs to their horses and cantered out across the plateau. It was a hellish hot day, and they were not really concentrating, and they'd cantered for some miles when they looked up to find that there were no cattle and no kids. In open country, they had simply disappeared. Bells were ringing, and no one was listening. Raw and his men rode through the place where they thought they'd seen the cattle and the kids. They trotted up a stony ridge, and as those who got out relate, and it's really impossible to consider what then happened without feeling one's hackles rise. My God, they said. We had to rein in our horses to prevent our horses falling into a ravine, and they stared, aghast, at what was in this ravine. Below and beyond them, stretching along the course of this Ingwebini stream, off in an easterly direction as far as the eye could see. Packed in there, squatting in absolute silence on their great war shields, regiment by disciplined regiment, were the Zulus of the main Zulu army. It must have been quite a moment. Raw and his men dismounted from their horses, and with their Swinburne Henry carbines and their Martini Henry rifles, they fired into that packed mass. A reaction of fright, and the Zulus leapt to their feet. The Umtricho regiment screamed, "Usutu!" and they raced forward, and they had to be restrained by their chiefs or indunas. Remember, it was the day of the dead moon. The Zulus were not supposed to fight that day. But the Zulu command knew that if they were to retain their element of surprise, they would have to attack there and then. Within minutes, those excited young warriors, particularly those of the Umtricho who had yet to bathe their assegais in the blood of an enemy, had been calmed. Raw and his men mounted their ponies and fled, and the Zulus streamed out of the head of that ravine across the plateau, and they moved towards the rim. They spread out into the horns of the buffalo, just like Hannibal did at Cannae. The Battle of Isandlwana had started with Raw's first shot. Back at Isandlwana, everyone was blissfully unaware of what was happening on that plateau to the north, 6 miles away. We know about this because of the testimony of one of the 5 officers who escaped the massacre. His name was Gardner, Captain Alan Gardner, of the 14th Hussars, and he had just arrived in the camp with Chelmsford's message for Pulain to strike the camp. Chelmsford had identified the new campsite. Pulain read the message and put it in his pocket, and Gardner and Pulain were standing together in the mouth of Pulain's tent, and they looked up at that plateau to the north. They saw a lone horseman, coming off the plateau with the speed of the clappers. Within minutes he'd reined in his horse outside Pulain's tent. He was out of breath and in a state of mortal funk. He had every reason to be. His name was Shepston, George Shepston, a son of the famous Sir Theophilus. Shepston had been with Raw, and he'd seen what was coming, and he blurted out the unbelievable news that the main Zulu army was not off to the south and to the east, where Chelmsford was blundering around looking for it, but to the north and to the east. And at this very instant there were 25,000 Zulu warriors in full regalia and full formation about to hit that camp at Isandlwana. Pulain's reaction, I believe, was one of lack of reaction. He simply sat down at his portmanteau and he penciled another note to Chelmsford. "Heavy firing to the left of our camp. Cannot move camp at present. Signed H.B. Pulain, Lieutenant Colonel," which hardly conveys any sense of urgency. Almost in an act of insubordination, Captain Gardner penned a second note, advising Major Cleary on Chelmsford's staff that Shepstone had come in for reinforcements, Raw's Basutos were falling back, and that the whole British force at Isandlwana was turned out about a mile in front of the camp. In other words, the line was too far out. The messages were given to a dispatch rider, another lucky boy, and he was told to take them out to the southeast and deliver them to Chelmsford's staff. These messages, alas, only reached Chelmsford after the battle was over. The dust from that dispatch rider's horses' hooves had yet to settle, and Gardner and Pullaine looked up at the plateau again. They saw a thin black snake coming over the skyline at the notch. They picked up their glasses, and they saw, my God, that the snake was made up of Zulus, thousands of them, and that the snake had a head, and that this head was making for that rocket battery, which was busy toiling up the lower slopes of the plateau. One can only imagine the scene out there with Major Francis Broadfoot Russell's rocket battery. Well, chaps, we've got the advancing savages. Erect the bipod against the trough. Aim the apparatus at the savages. Place the rocket in the trough. Pull the string and stand back. They managed to loose off one rocket, which exploded against the plateau. But the Zulus never flinched. This was a different enemy, this one. And the Zulus were onto them, hacking at the men left and right. Pullaine and Alan Gardner must have been utterly appalled as they watched the rocket battery being destroyed in seconds, 3 miles off, at the base of the plateau. They must have been appalled too, as they watched that snake of Zulus get longer and thicker. They saw it curl around the back of the conical hill and stream out across the plain. And within minutes, and it was minutes, and Lord Chelmsford had been right when he had said, "Treat the Zulus like cavalry, for heaven's sake, that's how fast they move." They could hear the dim crackle of rifle fire coming from across the plain, 4 miles east of Isandlwana. Durnford was engaged. A number of colonial officers, and some of these men were to get out of this mess. One would therefore expect the most lucid account of what happened to Durnford in this battle would come from the pen of a white man. We couldn't be more wrong. The most moving and I believe complete account of what happened to our friend with the long moustaches and the withered arm comes from the pencil of one of his beloved black sergeants. Jabez Molefe was his name, and he records in his stilted English what then happened. The Zulus came at us across the plain. Our colonel, and we loved this man so much, and this pathetic epithet appears in almost every paragraph, ordered us to dismount from our ponies. We were told to loop the reins of our horses through our arms and fire into the advancing Zulus. We killed them by the 100, but those brave men kept on coming until they were so close that our colonel ordered us to leap into the saddles of our ponies and fall back. Then we were told to dismount, loop the reins again, and fire into the advancing Zulus who kept on coming. And so a tactical withdrawal was made, a series of retreats and stands as Durnford retired obliquely towards Isandlwana, until he reached a deep donga 2,000 yards east of the saddle of Isandlwana. He took up a position in this donga. It had high walls, and the base of the donga was sheltered. He used it as if it were a huge trench. He ordered the men to extend south along the donga, ordered them to dismount, knee-halter their horses, and to lie on the left bank of the donga and fire into the advancing Zulus. Durnford was now in a strong position, and here he pinned the Zulus. The Zulus lay down in the long grass and in the millie fields which are still there to this day, and in and about an abandoned Zulu village, and Durnford was giving them a pounding. Jabez said, "We'd never seen our chief like this. His eyes were on fire, and he was laughing and joking with the men. He was walking up and down the line. The rifles of some of the men were jamming. The primitive coiled brass cartridges frequently stuck in the breeches when the rifles got hot, and the ejecting claw often failed to extract the spent cartridge properly. Durnford would go up to the most junior private soldier who was having problems with his rifle. He would take the rifle from the man. Placing it between his knees, he would expertly free the cartridge with a flick from his good hand. He would insert a fresh cartridge, close the lever, and hand the rifle back to the man. Patting him lovingly on the back, he would say to him, 'Fire away, my boy.' Oh, we loved this man," Jabez said. Everything was under control. Back in the camp, beneath the Sphinx Mountain, the men were watching the battle develop. The attention of the men was absolutely riveted upon what was happening in Durnford's donga. There were 6,000 men fighting down there, and the Zulus were obviously getting a severe drubbing. Some later said that they then noticed some activity on the low ridge where the 7-pounder guns of the Royal Artillery had been placed on the knuckle of the line. One of the big 7-pounders was being prepared for a sighting shell. There was a great explosion as the gun was fired, and a shell went screaming out across the field, and it landed bang in the middle of that abandoned Zulu village, within which many Zulus were taking cover, blasting these poor souls to kingdom come. The sighting shell had been spot on, and a cheer rang out along that British firing line, and of course the cheer was, "3 cheers for the Royal Artillery! Hip hip hooray!" Several shells followed, wreaking havoc amongst the Zulus. Everything was under control. Captain William Penn Simons of the 24th wrote a history of this regiment. He, as it happened, was the first British general to lose his life in the Great Boer War. He interviewed a man who got out of this mess, who gave him some more of the magic of this battle. The man told him that he was in the camp, and that something then prevailed upon him, and he turned his head, and he looked up at the hills to the north of the camp. He was to get the fright of his life. He said that as he looked, he saw the most awful, staggering sight that he ever was to see. The whole range of hills, the Mutu, its entire length of 3.5 miles, suddenly, in an instant, became covered in dense black masses as the main Zulu army stepped out onto the skyline north of the camp. The Zulus, expertly using the topography and choreographing their arrival to achieve exactly that effect. It was part of their tactic. Now we're rattling their spears and thumping the shafts of those assegais into the leather of their shields, noises clearly audible from the camp. That, indeed, was the awesome sight that faced those British soldiers out on the firing line. One can only imagine what they must have thought. Henry Pulain's reaction to the arrival of the Zulus is not recorded, but it probably excited him. He was going to get a battle after all. Perhaps he reasoned that he had 1,774 men on his side, most of whom were armed with Martini Henry rifles. Many of the men were superbly trained, experienced soldiers. The rifle was developed for exactly the sort of warfare, in the open, and in expert hands could be expected to deliver up to 12 rounds per minute, and it could fire a 600-grain slug of lead accurately at ranges in excess of 600 yards. "Roll on, Zulus, roll on," he may have thought, "and we'll thump them in the open, and when Chelmsford gets back, we'll give him the keys." Whatever Pulain's thoughts, I believe he must have felt some discomfort a few minutes later when a message was brought down to him from the ridge to the north of the camp. The messenger told him that a huge wing of the Zulu army had separated itself from the masses on the heights of the plateau, and that these Zulus had gone down the valley that extends away from Isandlwana to the northwest, and that the 2 companies on the ridge had been firing into this force for some time, but they had not managed to elicit any response from them at all. The Zulus were simply moving down that valley, away from them, at their own speed. Perhaps this message perplexed Pulain. Zulus moving away from Isandlwana? If Pulain was perplexed, and we will never know if he was, I don't believe he remained perplexed for too long, because a short while later he got a message from the lookout posted to the western side of the Isandlwana hill. The man came hopping and skipping down the rocks and boulders to Pulain's tent with an ominous message which must have sent a shiver down Pulain's spine. "Colonel Pulain, sir, there is a great mass of Zulus astride the road leading back to Rorke's Drift, sitting on their shields, with their arms folded, as it were. And I believe it was at this moment that the penny with Queen Victoria's head on it dropped on the toe of Henry Pulain. My God, the horns of the buffalo." That force just described was the right horn of the Zulu army. That force against Durnford in the Donga was the left horn of the Zulu army. And the mass on the plateau was the head and the chest of the Zulu army. And I put it to you that up until this point, the British High Command never believed that the Zulus could ever deploy their tactic on this sort of grand scale, with the horns 5 miles apart. I also put it to you that for far too long we have painted this battle as a British blunder. And the time has come for us to consider this battle for what it really was. It was a great Zulu victory. And it's high time that we arrogant English-speaking people learn to doff our hats to Nchingwayo Gamahole Koza, the Zulu commander-in-chief. There he sits on those huge rocks at Inyoni, on the Ngutu escarpment. It was his day. He was in his early 70s, a big-boned, impressive man. He had run all the way from Mulundi with his men. Can you imagine what that did for the morale of the Zulu army as they moved through the green hills of Zululand, cutting great swathes through the grassland that was still visible 6 months later? When Nchingwayo saw that the horns of his buffalo were in position, he rose up, and smiling at his induna sitting on the rocks behind him, he clenched his fists and he shouted, "Aye, Hlome, to arms. We've got them. Let's go." And the command then rippled out that those grandsons of Shaka on the top of that plateau could now descend into the killing field. Men who escaped tell us that the descent of the Zulu force from that plateau was orchestrated with a precision that would have done justice to a military tattoo. The Zulus rattled their spears and chanted great rhythmic chants which rolled out across the hills, and they stamped their feet with great stamps that almost seemed to shake the earth. And thousands of ululating women swarmed onto the heights that they just descended from, spurring the men folk on with their blood-curdling cries. Isandlwana has little changed. It is one of those precious places that one can visit, and if one allows oneself to be carried along by the story, if one fuzzes one's focus and allows this unchanged topography do its work of hypnosis, one can walk off the field, not just with a feeling of what it must have been like to have been there that day, but indeed with a feeling of what it was like. The regiments were easily identifiable by the patterns on their shields. And here they come, those regiments. The Umtricho, and the Umbonambi, and the Unokenke, and the Sangu, and the Uturutu, and the Umqab, and the Umhlanga, the Utloko, and the Utulwana, the Indlondlo, and the Indluyengwe. And that great black tide, having descended off the plateau, lapped up against that thin British firing line. And the two companies that were posted on the ridge had quickly to slide off the south side of their position and slot into that firing line to prevent themselves from being outflanked. And then a strange thing happened. Or perhaps it wasn't such a strange thing. The British line held. There is a popular misconception in this country that the British soldier was a Royneck, a redneck, that he was an anemic fellow who was imported into this country, and within minutes of exposure to the South African sun he would dissolve into an amorphous heap of sunburn. Nothing could be further from the truth. The 1st Battalion of the 24th Regiment had been in this country since 1875. They had marched from Cape Town, across the Karoo to Kimberley, a distance of 500 miles over a semi-desert. Their mission was to quell the Black Flag Rebellion, which by the time they got to Kimberley had quelled itself. They then marched from Kimberley to the Eastern Cape, where they fought and won the 9th Frontier War against the Amaxhosa in difficult circumstances in the Prairie Bush and the Amatole Mountains. These men had marched over 1,000 miles in this country before they fired a shot. Some of the lucky ones were shipped from East London to Durban. The rest of them marched all the way up the coast, and then in the summer of 1878, 1879, they had marched from Durban to Isandlwana. These were no Roynecker. Many of them were short, bronzed, bearded little Welshmen from an industrially depressed Wales. How green was my valley. Remember that lovely thing that Llewellyn did on the depression in Wales. That's why many of them took the shilling. There was nothing for them in the valleys. And they stood on that firing line, and they fired their Martini Henry rifles into that packed mass. They were good men, and they gave the Zulus an awful pasting. And I believe that this battle very nearly went the other way. This was nearly a British victory. If my family has made a contribution to the story of this battle, it is that we have assimilated a great deal of the Zulu oral tradition concerning the saga. My father and George Bunting spent many days pottering about these battlefields at a time when there were still some old folk alive who remembered this day. George Bunting, as a young person, interviewed hundreds of warriors who'd fought in this battle. When Nicky and I were building the lodge, Satchmo Mpanza and I would load up our old pickup truck with a hamper that Nicky would pack for us, and we would go out to the Kubutu Valley near Isandlwana, and we'd pick up our old Zulu friend Mnandi Ngobese, and we would take him out to the battlefield. Mnandi Ngobese is dead. He died in October of 1993, and I miss him terribly. With his death, a whole era has passed. Mnandi's father was a senior officer in this battle. He commanded a wing of the Ngoba Makhosi regiment. Mnandi had the dignity of Mahatma Gandhi, and we would walk with him, Satchmo and I. It was like a drug for us, and we really couldn't get enough of it. "Do you remember your father, Mnandi?" "Ngimkhumbula mpela," he would reply. "I remember him very well. His father was killed by the Natal colonial forces in the Bambata Rebellion in 1906. "Did he ever talk of Isandlwana?" He would chuckle. He never spoke of anything else. "When you were a small boy, did you ever walk over this ground with him when you were herding cattle? And did he ever show you where he stood? And did he ever tell you what happened here?" "Njalo. Indeed he did. Take us, Mnandi, please. Take Satchmo and I. Show us what he showed you and tell us what he told you." And he would always take us to the rocks just beyond the knuckle on the British line where the guns were. He would sit us amongst those rocks, and it wasn't long before we were listening to the old warrior Mehloka Gaschayo himself. It was there, Mnandi said, that his father had told him that this battle was won and lost. Beyond that spot there was a swale, a flay, in which long grass grew. In this long grass the warriors of the Umchicho regiment, those young warriors that were yet to bathe their assegais in the blood of the enemy, were lying. They were being killed hand over fist by British rifle fire, and their line started to waver. Mnandi Ngobese was adamant that this battle very nearly went the other way. Then a strange thing happened, something that the Zulu nation would never forget. One of the chiefs, Mkhosana Gamvundlana of the Biela clan, the Induna, the chieftain of the Umchicho regiment, leapt to his feet, right at the back, and came running through the Zulus until he was right in the front line, exposing himself recklessly to British bullets. He yelled at those warriors who were falling back, a shout which is still a rallying cry for these people to this very day. "Hey Nina," he shouted. "Hey Nina Lapaya, Ninkabalegi, Ukretwayo Gashongo Njalo. Hey you over there, don't you dare run away. Ukretwayo never told you to run away." And as we watched, and this old Zulu wept when he told us the story, a British bullet struck Mkhosana of the Biela people right between the eyes and killed him in his tracks. And so struck were we Zulus. So struck were we with what this old man Mkhosana had done for us and for our people. And for all these people in all these villages, for our sons and for their sons, that after he'd been struck down, not one Zulu moved back 1 inch. And I remember coming home that day after hearing the story and trying to explain what had happened, about how Satchmo and I had to leave old Mnandi Ngobese sitting on a rock with his chin resting on his hands around the top of his ancient stick, eyes closed, tears streaming down his withered old face. Satchmo and I had to let him recover, and we had to recover too. And then we came back and we helped him to his feet. We walked him back to the vehicle, and we drove away in silence. We walked him through the veld and left him with one of his young wives. What he had just driven home to me, in his sensitive way, was that we seemed to be preoccupied about how our history pivots on the actions of a few people. Lord Carnarvon, Bartle Frere, Lord Chelmsford, Dartnell, Durnford, Pullane. I had told this old man that it was my intention to tell the story to people who would, I hoped, come to hear it. He was now saying, "My boy, promise me that you will never ever tell the story without telling the people who the great hero of this battle was. He was Mkhosana Gamvundlana of the Biela clan. It was because of him that the Zulu line held." One must imagine a huge crescent of black lapping up against this thin British line. The right extremity of the British position was not engaged. There, Lieutenant Charlie Pope and 172 members of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot were out on a limb, as it were. Something of an impasse occurs now, as the opposing forces took measure of each other. Lieutenant Horace Lockwood Smith-Dorrien was back in the camp, having returned with Durnford, and he said in a letter which he later wrote to his dad that the Zulus were giving vent to no great war cry, but to a low musical murmuring sound. The Zulus, he said, sounded like a gigantic swarm of angry bees getting nearer and nearer. This must have put the fear of God into the British force, particularly into the breasts of those untrained untrainables who'd felt the wrath of Shaka only a few generations before. No one knows what happened at Isandlwana, but we are sure that Colonel Durnford, still down there in the donga, was having some difficulties with his ammunition. Survivors tell us that the rate of fire that was being delivered by those men started suddenly to diminish, and Colonel Durnford noticed that his men were rummaging through their pouches and pockets. They were running out of ammunition. Colonel Durnford immediately sent a Basotho rider up to the camp with 2 empty saddlebags for ammunition, and instructions for the quartermaster to send a mule cart with ammo down to his position. The man galloped the 2,000 yards back to the saddle, but in the confusion of wagons, to which by now had been added the confusion of the arrival of Durnford's wagons, he couldn't find his wagon, and precious minutes were wasted looking for it. Eventually, exasperated, he saw Quartermaster James Bloomfield calmly handing out packets of ammunition from open boxes to the men of his 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot. I believe that the boxes were quite easy to open, and I find it difficult to believe that this disaster came about because of a lack of screwdrivers. The Basotho helped himself to these cartridges. The quartermaster saw him and remonstrated with him, shouting, "Don't take that, man, for God's sake! It belongs to our battalion!" Smith-Dorrien, a witness, said, "Hang it all, quartermaster! You don't want a requisition now, do you?" With that, Quartermaster Bloomfield fell dead with a bullet in the brain, a spent Zulu slug that had arced out across the field and killed him. Many Zulus had guns, obsolete old tower muskets and Enfield Snyders that they had traded from unscrupulous traders like John Dunn before the Zulu War, and we are never going to know if that Basotho ever got his ammunition down to Durnford, and I put it to you that it doesn't really matter. History tells us that Durnford pulls out of that donga because he was running out of ammunition, but I believe that he retired from that position for another, far more pressing reason. Do you really think that a military commander of the caliber of Inching Wayo would not have noticed that between Durnford's position and the saddle, that is the right flank of the British position, there were over 2,000 yards of completely undefended terrain? Of course he saw this, and his warriors were instructed to get around Durnford's right and into this huge gap. Durnford was thus threatened with being outflanked, and he had to retire from this position to prevent his men from being cut off. Durnford gave the order to get out of the donga, and the men leapt into the saddles of their ponies, and they pulled out of their strong position. And the Zulus leapt to their feet, and they screamed, "Usutu!" and they came at them. Durnford's men were now once again falling back ahead of an unstoppable Zulu force. Unfortunately, Durnford's timing was poor, though this was not Durnford's fault. At this instant, Charlie Pope, whose force in the line had hitherto not been engaged, took it upon himself to get his men into a rallying square, and he took them off the line down towards Durnford's donga. He could see that Durnford was in trouble, and at that very moment Durnford pulled back. But Durnford could fall back before the Zulus. He and his men were mounted, but Pope wasn't, and Pope and his men were caught in the open. The Zulus remembered Pope. He had 3 eyes, they said. Pope wore a monocle. The Zulu accounts tell us that they didn't even slow down. We just ran through them, hacking at them as we ran, and Pope and every member of his force were slaughtered where they stood. One Zulu account recalled that 70 men, with this man with the 3 eyes leading them, managed to back into a gully where they made quite a spirited stand, but there were too many of us. We killed them all. Pope was history. When Major Wilson Black, 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, returned to Isandlwana 6 months later to effect the burial of these men, they wandered down the little rutted wagon road for 1,000 yards. until it cut the first dry watercourse. Here the men duffed their Glengarry caps and they wept at what they saw. Their comrades were lying in heaps. There were 67 skeletons lying, touching, in one heap. And some of the rib cages of these skeletons were still clad in the tattered red tunics of their 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot. The brass sphinxes now turning green with corrosion on their collars. Behind Charlie Pope, there were 3 detachments of the Natal native contingent under the leadership of Captains Barry, Stafford and Lonsdale. And when these untrained and untested troops saw a stalwart force of British soldiers being wiped out in front of them, they understandably broke and fled, and they streamed up towards the saddle. There was now panic in the camp. And I want to put it to you that the whole situation at Isandlwana turned in the time that it took a fine Zulu warrior to run from Durnford's Donga to Pope's position on the line. I also want to put it to you that this battle happens faster than I am able to tell you about it. The camp was filled with camp followers, clerks, cooks, bandsmen, bottle washers, wagon conductors and medical personnel. And these men started to stream in a panic-stricken shuffle towards the wagon park. They pushed themselves through that sea of bellowing oxen. The oxen knew what was going to happen to them. And when they got to the saddle, they were met by the NNC. And the momentum of their meeting carried this retreating mass of black and white over the saddle. And they looked into the valley west of Isandlwana. And what did they see? Zulus, thousands of them. And even as they looked, the Utududu regiment separated from that right horn of the Zulu army and came streaming up the slope towards them, and they got caught. These were the fugitives, many of them white men, overweight white men, out of condition, and they were quickly caught and speared by the athletic warriors. They were trapped like pockets of sardines in this hostile sea. But the black soldiers of the Natal native contingent were just as fleet of foot as their Zulu counterparts, and they, being pushed by the Zulus more south and west, managed to make their way through all that broken ground down to the Buffalo River at the fugitive drift 5 miles away, and you will hear in due course what happened to them. Meanwhile, Colonel Durnford's force retired in good order up the right flank of the British position towards the camp, keeping as many of his Zulu opponents as possible to his right. Durnford eventually got back to the camp, and just out of the tented camp and just out of the wagon park in a patch of open country near the northwestern base of the little stony hill south of the saddle, Durnford made his famous last stand. It was there that he made his British square. Durnford shouted at the men, "Don't run, don't run, come and stand with me. You can't run from these people, I know them well." And the men flocked to him. He was a charismatic man. The 48-year-old Durnford must have taken great solace in these last moments of his unhappy life from the fact that many of the men who flocked to him, and indeed died in heaps around him, were his greatest critics. They were the soldiers of the Natal Carbineers, those that had been with him in the Bushman's River Pass. Jabez Molefe and others remembered well what happened. Molefe, together with another sergeant, Simeon Kambula, son of Durnford's beloved Elijah Kambula, who had died at Durnford's side in the Bushman's River Pass, went up to him and asked him what they and their Edendale contingent men should do. Durnford told these sergeants to take the 70 Edendale men and to try to hold the high ground north and south of the saddle. They were to try to keep the saddle free of Zulus. Jabez and Simeon begged Durnford to leave the field with them. The little stony hill was turning black with Zulus. They tugged at his sleeve, remonstrating with him, but he would not come. Jabez later said that if they'd known how stubborn he was going to be, they would have tied him up and they would have taken him with them. Durnford indicated that it was his duty to stay with his men, and that he wanted to stay with his men. And we suspect that it was at this moment that Durnford entrusted his beloved horse chieftain to Molefe and Kambula and bade them leave, and God Jesus be with you. They left him, leading the horse. And when they got to the edge of the wagon park, they turned and looked back at him, and there he was, laughing and joking with his men, their chief with his long moustaches and his withered arm. And these two humble sergeants then turned and moved away. So moved were they at what had happened that they were unable to talk to each other for the rest of the day. What a lovely tale of the relationship that existed between this officer and his black sergeants. It was at this moment that Durnford shouted that famous command that was to be immortalized in the caption of a sketch done for the graphic newspaper. At Bay, it was entitled, and the caption records that the last order that we heard given was, "Fix bayonets, boys, and die like British soldiers do." And of course, so they did. There are many stories that emanate from the death of Durnford with his long moustaches and his withered arm. My father's friend George Bunting, as a little boy, while making the epic 100-mile horse ride journey from the family farm at Kuteni to the railhead at Glencoe to catch the train to go to school, was chaperoned by an old Zulu man who wore a headring and a kaross. The old man exposed this child to a wealth of stories from the mouths of people who were there. The old man and the child would always stop at Isandlwana, which was on their route. And it was the magic of the old Zulu storytelling ability round the campfire that was to mould this baby Bunting into one of the greatest white authorities on this nation that there has ever been. Bunting got the story from the horse's mouth. I was so lucky as a child to be left to spend my school holidays with the Buntings, and I accompanied him so many times onto the field of Isandlwana when he was telling his tale to people who came from all over the world to hear his magic. And then it was my turn to be the little boy. The area southeast of the saddle the boy hears from the old man was a sea of black, within which, bobbing around like a cork, was a little knot of British soldiers. In the front line of the Zulu force, some Zulus are exhausted. They force their way back through the throng of excited warriors until they are clear of them. They find 2 British soldiers lying dead. They rummage through their pockets, finding 2 cartridges. They take a rifle that they find lying next to the men, and they force their way back to the warriors. They notice that the number of British soldiers had diminished in their absence. The old man tells the child that he, young warrior, took the rifle, and he works out how this complicated lever-action rifle functions. He slips a cartridge into the breech, he closes the lever and aims into the men. The British by now had run out of cartridges, and had taken their knives, their bayonets from their belts and fixed them onto their rifles, and hell hath no fire like a British soldier with a bayonet fixed. The Zulus had by now expended their throwing spears, and they were reduced to picking up the bodies of their dead and hurling them onto the bayonets of these British rifles in order to get those guns down, so that they could get in there with their stabbing spears. The old man tells the boy that he looked down the barrel of his gun into the face of a man. He pulled the trigger, and he killed him. He was sorry he'd done this, and he always had been. He'd carried the burden of this memory with him always. It was not the Zulu way to shoot a man down like a dog. It was the Zulu way to stab, fighting hand to hand, not to shoot a man when he couldn't shoot back. The boy understood that the old man was trying to atone, and he accepted the apology on behalf of the dead soldier, which pleased his old friend no end. This went on for some time, until there came from the rear of the warriors a great shout from the throat of that great warrior chieftain, "Usigcwele Cwele Gam Hlege Hlege," the officer in command of the Ngoba Makosi regiment, the Benders of the Kings. This is another of these great cries which would be used to rally this nation for years to come. "Venina lapaya, Nsamvana wabula mlilo kashongo njalo." There you over there, the little branch that extinguished the fire, one of Tchechwaya's praise names, never ordered us to dally like this. And with this, the warriors of the Ngoba Makosi regiment screamed, "Usutu!" and they fell upon Durnford and his men. Those warriors years afterwards recalled that there was a man in the midst of the British who caught their attention and fired their imaginations. He was one of the last to die, and was laughing and joking with his men right up to the end. He was a tall man, they said, and he had a wide brow and long moustaches, and his left arm was withered and kept in a sling at his side. Durnford was dead. Ah, those red soldiers at Isandlwana, the Zulu said, like lions they fought, and like stones they fell, each man falling like a stone in his place. I believe that Henry Pullaine, from his command position above the centre of the camp, witnessed the demise of Anthony Durnford. But I humbly submit that we are now in the realms of conjecture, and we will never know. I also believe that, in compliance with Durnford's orders, Pullaine couldn't bring his line in until Durnford retired. So when Durnford began to pull back from the donga to the camp, Pullaine gave an instruction to his bugler to blow the retire, and the bugler, with his lips a-quiver, blew the retire. Horace Smith-Dorrien said, "Above the row of battle I heard a bugle sound the retire." And the Zulu accounts tell us that they heard one of those copper things that you British people use to make noises. With that, as Mnandi Ngobes explained to us, The soldiers began to scurry about like ants as they got into retreating squares and began a fighting withdrawal back to the camp. What a thrill it was to hear this tale from Mnandi in Zulu, this language, with all its alliteration and rhythm and rhyme. Yithi abantu bamnyama, and we black people, sasokuma jenga ikakasi elikhulu elimnyama lasolwandle. We rose up like a great big black wave of the ocean. We rose up, and we fell back with them. The officers of those companies on the line must have wondered why that instruction had not come. They must have been critically aware of their predicament so far out, and that bugle call must have been music to their ears. One must now imagine that the huge crescent of Zulus is on its feet, and within that immense black mass there are conspicuous blocks of British red making their way back to the camp. The dribble of white stone cairns on the battlefield today is telling you the story. It was a tactical withdrawal that failed, most important of which was that the tents of the camp had not been struck. There was a standing order in the British Army that in the event of an infantry attack on one's camp, the first thing one had to do was to strike that camp. That is, one had to kick the pole out and lay the canvas of the tent flat on the ground, so that one's enemy would never be able to use one's camp for their cover. This was never done at Isandlwana. The Zulus tell us that they got the upper hand when they got into the camp. A red soldier would back into the wall of a tent with his bayonet fixed, and we Zulus would dart around the back of the tent. We'd open the tent with a slash of the assegai, and then we'd stab him through the wall. We knew when we'd got him, the white would turn scarlet. The camp soon becomes a sea of black with fast disappearing blobs of British red in it. The Zulus went berserk in that camp, slashing at the tents, burning what they could, smashing medicine bottles and stabbing the tin meats. On the right flank of the camp they were tossing wagons onto their sides and stabbing the things that they loved most, the oxen. They were throwing the British dead onto their backs and disemboweling them, according to good Zulu custom, to free their spirits. They were tossing drummer boys around on the bayonets of captured rifles. They dragged two of them, kicking and screaming, and they swung them up from butcher's hooks from the backs of wagons, and they opened them up like sheep. The Zulus would excise the gallbladders from the guts of these dead soldiers, and then having sucked out the gall, they would scream, "Gadla! I have eaten," shouts that were to haunt the few that got out for the rest of their days. This is what happened at Isandlwana. And in this bloody bedlam, Henry Pullaine stepped into his tent one more time, this time to fetch out the Queen's colour of the 1st Battalion of the 24th Regiment, to which all regimental honour was attached. He emerged from the tent, and seeing Lieutenant Tynemouth Melville, adjutant of the 24th, he called to him, and in the most moving ceremony, as a nameless witness in a Natal newspaper was later to relate, he handed it to Melville with the words, "The Queen's colour. You are to take it to a place of safety, and Godspeed, and God be with you." And the two men saluted each other solemnly, and Melville wheeled his horse and punched away through the Zulus, and you will hear later what happened to him at the Fugitive Drift. In the meantime, Captain Reginald Younghusband and C Company 1st Battalion 24th had fought their way intelligently up the side of the Isandlwana mountain, and they were now on the shoulder of the hill. Younghusband got on top of a large rock, and his men, bayonets fixed, clustered about the rock with their backs to it. One can only imagine what they saw. They saw Durnford die. They saw Henry Pullaine entrust the Queen's colour to Melville and send it off the field. That most precious banner to which the whole ethos of their military being was attached was being sent off the field because there was no hope. Surf qui peut, alia jacta est. It was over. They could also see that the track back to Rorke's Drift was black with Zulus. And they could see those pockets of British red moving hopelessly off to the southwest down the fugitive trail through and into that black sea of oblivion. The story is brilliantly taken up by some Zulu accounts. We can be most thankful that people like Bertram Mitford interviewed some of these warriors only a few years later. Some of them described the terrible orgy of destruction in the camp. One then described how the sun then went dark like night. The eclipse started. The computer tells us that this event started at 10 minutes past 1. The Zulus tell us that the tumult and the firing was wonderful. Every warrior shouted, "Utsutu," as he killed. Some of them looked up through the smoke at the hill. On the shoulder of the hill on a large rock they saw a British officer standing with his men about the rock, bayonets fixed. The warriors raced up the steep slope towards them. The British had run out of ammunition, and the Zulus forced them right up against the crag of the Isandlwana hill. One Zulu account tells us how these opposing forces glared at each other. Then a Zulu induna ordered the men to wait, "Yimani," and allow the British officer to shake hands with his men. Then the officer pulled a great knife from his belt, and he whirled it around his head. And the men all came running down at us, yelling and screaming, and we fell upon them and we killed them all. The Zulus noticed that one British soldier had crept into a small cave. He had obviously hoarded some cartridges, with which he kept the Zulus at bay. He impressed the Zulus no end. He did not blaze away hurriedly, but he loaded quietly, and taking deliberate aim, he killed a Zulu man with every shot. Some Zulus descended into the camp and broke open ammunition boxes. Stuffing the pouches with the ammunition, they bounded back up the hill. They took guns from the men that they had killed, and they got behind large boulders beneath the cave, and they fired into it. And eventually, after a long time had passed, they killed him. They expressed sorrow at this. Unesbindis Kulu. He was a man of great courage. Some hlonipha bad. We really respected him. When we had killed him, we turned, and we noticed that the shadow of the Isandlwana mountain had touched the plain. The eclipse was over. That man in the cave might have been alive hours after the second last man died. 1,329 men on the British side lay dead. 52 British officers were killed in this battle. More were killed here than were killed at Waterloo. The number of Zulu dead will never be known, but I believe it to be in the region of 3,000. There could have been 4,500 bodies lying around the Sphinx Mountain. I think the saddest part of the whole story is what the Zulus had to say of this battle. Cetshwayo the king said of this battle, "Sakwazo sisweni." An assegai had been thrust deep into the belly of the nation. This was a Pyrrhic victory. The Ngoba Makosi, the Benders of the Kings, the Umbonambi and the Umtricho regiments would never, ever fight properly again. Back in Pietermaritzburg, the bishop, that brave Bishop Kelenzo, preached a sermon to the bereaved white people who'd lost sons in the battle.
Wherein in our invasion of Zululand have we shown that we are men who love mercy? Did we not lay upon the people heavily from the moment we crossed their border the terrible scourge of war? Have we not killed already, it is said, 5,000 human beings and plundered 10,000 head of cattle? It is true that in that dreadful disaster, on account of which we are this day humbling ourselves before God, we ourselves have lost very many precious lives, and widows and orphans, parents, brothers, sisters, friends, are mourning bitterly their sad bereavements. But are there no griefs, no relatives that mourn their dead in Zululand? Have we not heard how the wail has gone up in all parts of the country for those who have bravely died? No gallant soldier, no generous colonist will deny this, have bravely and nobly died in repelling the invader and fighting for their king and fatherland. And shall we kill 10,000 more to avenge the losses of that dreadful day? Will that restore us to those we have lost? Will that endear their memories more to us? Will that please the spirits of any true men, true sons of God among the dead? Above all, will that please God, who requires of us that we do justly and love mercy?
One doesn't have to be a great military authority to appreciate the military error that was made at Isandlwana. The line was too far out. Communication between senior officers leaving a lot to be desired, and of course the scouting had allowed that huge impi to get so close to the British position. But underpinning the whole saga is that inescapable fact that they had underestimated these Zulu people, and we must never, ever make that error again. I believe that it would be inappropriate to what if this battle. What if Chelmsford had not gone out? What if Durnford had not gone out? What if Charlie Raw had not discovered the Zulus lying in that gully on the day of the dead moon? What if Henry Pullane had understood the threat that he was under, and he'd fallen back onto the high ground having struck the camp with his ammunition? What if Mkosana Gamvundlana of the Biela clan had not given his life for his people? Who knows? Perhaps Disraeli would have been elected to another term. It doesn't really matter. I believe that the whole ethos of this great Victorian battle piece, arguably the greatest battle piece of this whole era, is beautifully summed up in the inscription borne on a memorial which, as it happens, stands close to where our friend with the long moustaches and the withered arm breathed his last. In its own way, that inscription pertains to every man, black or white, Zulu or Basotho, Englishman, Welshman, or South African colonial who died on the field of Isandlwana. Not theirs to save the day, but where they stood, falling to dye the earth with brave men's blood, for England's sake and duty. Be their names sacred among us, neither praise nor blame add to their epitaph, but let it be simple, as that which marked Thermopylae. Tell it in England those that pass us by, here, faithful to their charge, her soldiers lie.